What is a government of national unity?
So I don't think what South Africa is going to have in 2024 is a government of national unity unless somebody can explain to me what they're trying to solve for. We have treated our democracy as a thing where we give away power, not take it. I don't think what we're going to end up with is a true government of national unity. Ask white people the same question.
Welcome back to Palatable Politics, a show where we take the complexity out of politics and make it palatable for you. With me, your host, TJ Maslela. Welcome to the show. So we just had an election. There's a lot going on, a lot of interpretation of democracy, what it is, the voter turnout, the results, and what it means. Here to give us insight and make it palatable for us is Tessa Dooms, who's a democracy, governance, and policy expert, and also a director at Rivonia Circle. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Can you give us a bit of a background as to who you are and how you landed up in the space that you are?
Oh, wow. This is one question I wasn't expecting. I am a Joburger, born and raised in Eldorado Park. And that for me is important because a lot of the ways in which I got involved in activism stem from being from a township in South Africa, but in Joburg in particular. And so started doing activism really in my community, through church, all of that when I was a teenager. And actually didn't think I was doing activism at the time. Really just was getting involved in community and getting involved with young people in particular. I've always said that the reason why I do anything that I do is about making young people's lives in Africa better. And that's kind of been the trajectory of my career, has been young people. So I went and studied a BA, got a BA in sociology and psychology, eventually a master's, but during that time also taught. So I taught sociology, and that gave me a sense of a broader idea about fixing society. So a lot of our time and a lot of our thought when we think we're going to fix society is about fixing individuals. We spend a lot of time on kind of, how do you make individuals better? And I think that I started to think about how do you make society better? And how do you create a society in which functional individuals or dysfunctional individuals can start to find their way around? Working from one individual to the other just didn't seem like it made sense to me. And so structuring a society made more sense. But again, teaching, a focus on young people, trying to get them, prepared to be part of change in the world was a big part of where I started. Left academia and went into the civil society space for the first time through an organization called Youth Lab. And through Youth Lab, I did a lot of youth policy focused work, but also work in communities with young people and kind of getting insights from young people who were not in the political fray necessarily. So I did that for a while, then got involved with the National Planning Commission, got involved with the AU, got involved with the UN, got involved with a number of intergovernmental organizations. And I think that the big reason why that was an important part of my own journey was activism and working in communities can very much give you a sense that it's you versus the government, right? And a lot of our activism is framed around kind of, we're working, there's us and then there's them and there's the government. And we don't often think about our activism as we are actually part of the government. We are actually part of what it means to govern society. We think there's us on the outside of government and then there's the government. And I think having lived in both worlds to a certain extent, I've come to appreciate that there is government, but there's governance. And that government needs almost necessarily to be plugged into communities. And communities need to be plugged into government for democracy to work. And so in 2021, I kind of built a career for myself doing consulting work in the democracy and governance space and working for these multinational institutions, working in corporate spaces, working for NGOs, trying to help them, have good institutions that work with citizens. And then the 2021 July riots happened, and that changed everything for me.
What did it change?
So July riots, I realized that that even though I was a child from Aldos, from a township, that the way in which our society is constructed gave me enough privilege to be able to insulate myself from the worst of society. And so even as somebody who's plugged into communities, who's plugged into community organizers, especially marginal communities, township communities, and rural communities, I realized that there was a disconnect between the kind of privilege that my education, my networks, my life provided me, and the kind of change I wanted to create in society. And in that moment, I had to choose. Am I going to insulate myself from what happens in society? Or am I going to go double down on the original mission, which was, I'm not going to do what's best for individuals, even if that individual is me and my family. I'm going to do what's best for creating the kind of society that everyone can benefit from. And the July 21 riots were was the moment that taught me that made me think, how do I disrupt my own sense of I've built a life, like to build a life that makes sense in a society as dysfunctional as ours should make us all really uncomfortable. And that's what that did to me. It made me uncomfortable. And so when we started talking about the Rivonia Circle, we started talking about, number one, what are the crises in society that need to be fixed for? And then we zeroed in on the idea that there's a political and governance crisis. And that's something that all of us had an interest in and all of us wanted to do something about. And for me, that was the opportunity to say, we cannot just leave fixing the country to somebody sitting in government somewhere else. We have to give ourselves all a stake in what the future of the country looks like, and democracy needs to mean that we all govern rather than democracy is an elite pact between a few people, and it's only for some. And that's the work that I've been doing for the last 2 years.
In terms of a democracy, what does an ideal democracy look like, and what does our democracy look or feel like?
So I'll use the work that we do around something I call the democracy builder to answer that, because we have conversations with people in various communities and ask exactly that question. And the most obvious answers that come into all of our minds is that democracy is voting, it's having a government, it's having institutions, it's having freedom, it's having, these values that we associate with democracy. What I found is that the moment I ask people, what does it feel like to live in a democracy, especially young people who are below the age of 30, all of the answers we have are negative. Like, it's corruption. It's, people doing things, governments doing things without you knowing. It's unaccountable politicians. It's no services. It's all of these experiences we have that the majority of people in South Africa face is their experience of democracy. And that, for me, is the easiest way to say that what we experience as democracy versus what democracy is are different things. So we can already say that. But the conversations that we've had has also led us to two things. One is that we have gotten very caught up in an idea of democracy that I think is not necessarily the core. The core of democracy is people govern themselves. That's what the word democracy means. People govern. And that what we have created is a set of circumstances in which democracy is about somebody else governing, right? So a guy in Mlazi said this to us 2 years ago, and it really stayed with me. We were asking why young people don't vote. And he said, young people don't vote because we get the vote, but they get the democracy. Somebody else gets democracy. Somebody else gets the institutions. Somebody else gets those values. And we are often left with very little as the people who are voted. Voting feels, and participating in the democratic institutions for a lot of people feels disempowering. It doesn't feel like we are governing ourselves. And so for me, the important thing is that democracy isn't just values and institutions. The core of democracy is, are we as people able to govern our own lives? So what I often ask people in the context of of democracy building is how has this society enabled you to govern your own life? Are you able to govern your family? Are you able to govern your community? Are you able to govern in school? Are you able to make decisions about your life and co-govern in the society? Never mind the idea that there's a government, right? And that government must do its part. But democracy is about governance, co-governance of all of us that make up the society. And one of the things I think we've done wrong in the last 30 years, and the more I speak to people who fought during the liberation struggle, is that we have treated our democracy as a thing where we give away power, not take it. So it was like when we got to the 94 moment, everybody who had fought, now they had a vote, then used the vote to give away power, to give power to somebody else to govern you. And I think, and to an elite pact, right? Because number one, it's 400 people in parliament. It's approximately 1,000 people across parliament and the legislatures. If you add municipalities to that, maybe you're adding another 1,000 people. We cannot have 2,000 people govern an entire society, and we're just waiting for them to tell us whether we're going to go in this direction or that direction. The weakest part of our democracy right now is that we are not participating in governance as people outside of government or people outside of political structures, which is the majority of us.
So with that said, how do we go about changing it to have a more inclusive, representative, involved democracy?
I guess that's for me the big work, right? We're going to have to change the way we conceive of democracy. And I think I'll predicate that by saying I think democracy is in crisis around the world. I think that we are not unique in the fact that we are in a democracy and in crisis. I think democracies around the world are in crisis. And I think the number one reason democracies around the world are in crisis is that even in contexts where democracy is delivering on development, in our context, I don't think democracy is delivering on development. I think the majority of people in this country, especially young people, associate democracy with no development, lack of development, or failure. There's a study from Afrobarometer that says, it was done last year, that says 72% of people surveyed said they would give up the right to vote if they could get development outcomes. That's a really scary statistic for me, because it means that we've associated democratic institutions and democracy and voting with a lack of development and services. So we've given democracy a bad name by the way that we've gotten to this point. But I think that even in countries where democracy is delivering, for example, basic services. So if you think about a country like the US's democracy is in crisis. It's an actual crisis, right? And it's not because nobody has basic services. In some cases, it's because people don't have jobs. But even that, if we compared our job notes, we'd be doing way worse. But it's because people feel alienated from the system. It's because people feel like democracy is not their thing. It's somebody else's thing that's imposed on them. And that they're seeing the changing of hands amongst politicians. But they actually don't have a say. They don't have a voice. And I don't think that's different in our context. Is that we don't feel connected in. And so for me, the first thing is, let's start to reimagine what democracy can look like from the basis that we need more participation and more co-governance. So one of the things we ask people to do in Democracy Builders is what we call South Africa 2.0. And we ask people to imagine what an upgraded version of our democracy could look like, right? So I often use the analogy of having a cell phone. If you got a cell phone 30 years ago, they weren't even cell phones 30 years ago, but let's go with it, right? Okay. They weren't. Well, at least I didn't have access to a cell phone. I don't know about anyone else. But if the cell phone that I got when I got my first cell phone 20 years ago is the one that I was holding on to right now, you would tell me that I'm being silly. We have held on to the democratic edifice that we've had for 30 years without any questions about upgrading it. And we've been waiting for somebody else to upgrade it. We've been waiting for somebody else. We've been waiting for the next Mandela. We've been waiting for somebody to come. And I think that we have the responsibility to rethink what democracy is. the best thing about democracy is that it gives us the freedom to reimagine what it can be. Which means we must start asking ourselves, what parts of the institutions are working and what parts are not working? What parts of the values do we hold and which of the parts of the values do we not hold? What mechanisms do we have and which should we have? So to answer your question, one of the groups that we had, we asked them to redesign or reimagine one element of society, and they took local government. And after 20 minutes of deliberation, they said their answer is there should be no local government. That the way they would redesign our democracy and upgrade it is by removing the layer of local government so that communities can come up with their own budgeting plans for the things that they need. National approves it, the budget gets released project by project basis. I'd like to live in a country where we are able to be bold enough and brave enough to reimagine our society as radically as that and to assume nothing is taken for granted. If we truly have the ability to co-govern, to self-govern, to govern ourselves and our communities, our families, then we need to have very, I think, robust, interesting, wider conversations about how we construct a democratic edifice. But I think the first part is we must all think of ourselves as co-governing rather than being governed by someone else.
Is democracy really the golden key or golden pathway to development? Because, I mean, there are a number of countries we've seen that don't have democracy but have done very well, or a limited type of democracy. Your China, your Middle East. Should we also be considering something outside of democracy?
So when you think about development in economic terms, and purely in that sense, then sure, right? But there's also a part of this that is about the quality of our lives broadly, right? So am I willing to live in a country where I have water, but I have limits on my freedom? And limits on, not even limits on my freedom in general terms, limits on my freedom that can literally kill me. I don't want to have to make that decision, right? So I don't want to live in a country where if I say something bad about the president, I'm going to end up jailed. I don't want to live in that kind of country. It might get me water, but there are also certain fundamental senses of what it means to be human that we need to pursue at the same time. So is democracy the golden standard? For me, it depends on what kind of democracy we build. And I think at the core of it needs to be a centering of people. And I think you wouldn't want to live in a democracy where somebody else is making decisions for you. You want to be in one, or you want to be in a society where you are able to influence the decisions in your own life. An authoritarian environment where somebody else makes the decisions for you and then also limits your rights and then also limits your ability to access certain basic freedoms, basic necessities, basic human rights. I think that a democracy where we all understand that we all have human rights, number one, and number two, the ability to participate in governing our own lives is a good starting point.
One of the developments or advancing of our democracy was the Electoral Act amendments, which now brought in the element of independent candidates. How much of a step was that towards achieving, saying what an ideal democracy would be, and also given the results in the sense of how many actually made it to Parliament?
I don't think that the Electoral Amendment Bill is a good example of a successful project in trying to broaden our options. What it ended up being was asking Parliament, that is constituted of people who were voted in through a party system, to construct an electoral bill that allows people who are not in parties to have an equal say to those in parties. What you were asking for was for the chickens to vote for Christmas. That was never going to happen. And so I don't think we've come out with a bill that actually made it easy and fair for independent candidates to have a real shot at it, right? And I think part of the reason why we didn't end up there is because we've created a political environment, a political culture that centers parties and centers parties' power to not only design the way in which systems operate, but also to tell MPs what to do, right? And I think we'll talk about the government of national unity and coalitions and all of that. But one of the things I'm really excited about is that it's going to be much harder in the next 5 years for parties to simply tell MPs what the party line is, and then we just move along. Because that has been a fundamental frustration of South Africans. So people often ask, why do we have so many parties? We have fewer people voting, but we have so many parties. We have fewer people voting, but we have people who want to become independent candidates. Why is that? I think what it is that people don't want to vote for politicians, parties, and structures that are far away from them, right? One of the things we forget about how the ANC became the ANC is the branch structure, right? So I always call the ANC a big, small party. So it's a big party, but people's interaction with that party through the branch is meant to be incredibly localized. And that's what people are asking for. Whenever you speak to people about their frustrations with politics, it's about the fact that they don't know the people representing them, that accountability is hard to enact, that even in the local government sense, because even though we can directly represent or directly vote for people who represent us, that's made difficult by the need to have money and resources and all of that to campaign. And so we've gotten trapped by party politics. And unfortunately, it's become big party politics that has been most trapping, because people feel like they're disconnected from big party politics in terms of their day-to-day experience. So a lot of people have even said to us, even when people are from their own communities, parties don't give them the opportunity to actually select who in their community they would want. So the party then imposes people on you. And this is various parties, not just one, even at the local government level. That's the thing that people are riling against as we create these multiplicities of what I call micro parties. Because people are saying, I'm not expecting that my micro party somewhere in Kuruman, that we're going to elect the next president. What those people want is a seat at the table. So we've got 18 parties going into the next parliament, right? A lot of those parties are 1-seat parties, 2-seat parties. The people in those parties did the job, especially if those parties are micro, because they have a seat at the table and they have a representative who they know. They can go and find them. They can go and ask them what's happening in parliament. And so what I think that parties missed, and politicians and parliamentarians missed when they were doing the electoral amendment bill, is instead of being cognizant of what opportunity lies for increasing accountability and people's access through more constituency-based voting, we missed out that opportunity, because if you take away the centrality of the party and the party line, it becomes difficult for parties to be able to tell MPs what to do. And that was my hope for that process, that the Van Zyl-Slabbert report, which is a report that was done in 2002, the Kgalema Motlanthe report that was done, I think, in 2018, all that spoke to the idea that we have a politics that centers the party too much, and we need to think about a mixed system so that there's more accountability of MPs. All of that was ignored because parties want to be able to control their MPs. And I think we've just missed a centrally important opportunity, because as it stands right now, if I asked you to name 10 members of parliament who are not ministers, we will all struggle. And that's not the way it should work. MPs are supposed to be representatives of the people. When they take that oath on Friday this week, you will hear the oath is an oath to the people and the Constitution, not to their parties. Yet our system has made it about the parties and not about the people.
But would one not say it's almost a bit contradictory, because at local government level, you do somewhat have that system where each person votes for a ward councillor in their ward. But that, for whatever reason, hasn't necessarily turned out to be great service delivery. So we kind of have both, but there are issues with both, and saying, okay, maybe we should make this one like that one.
Yeah, so I think the thing that we're solving for is greater accountability, right? And I think the thing that we're pushing against is a political culture that doesn't want to bend to that. So I do think that there is that, it's not a silver bullet, but it definitely helps us solve a lot more for accountability than if we don't have it, right? At local government level, two things are true though. One is that more smaller parties and more independents do get into government in those points, which means that people have more access to the rooms of power there. The fact that bigger parties and the fact that there are these imbalances are still there because our political culture still moves in that direction. But I think it's better for people to have a voice and to be able to have access to being able to say, service delivery is not working in my area, then not. The second controversial thing I'll say is ask white people the same question. Ask white people the same question. Ask people who are saying to you, and I say white people because I'm being incredibly parochial, right? But people will tell you, I want to be in a particular kind of ward or in a particular kind of place because I know who my ward councillor is. And I'm going to bother my ward councillor until my ward councillor does something about the fact that we haven't had electricity for 3 days. The job of that ward councillor is to go and find that information. And white people are great complainers, so they will do it. They will complain until something happens. But that's also because they have a representative that they have taken the time to figure out who that person is and where that person stays and how to contact that person. We have created a block in our minds for the majority of society that, number one, says the ward councillor is just an instrument of a party. And therefore the ward councillor has no power. And the ward councillor tells us, I have no power. And I'm like, no, we must not accept that. And there are people who don't accept that. And so I think that, again, it's a political culture issue. Our culture of accountability needs to be increased so that we know what we can expect from whom. I think we've allowed for too long for people to just get away with saying, I'm just a little guy. And I'm like, no, you're a ward councillor. You have powers, you have access, and you have a vote. You have a say, right? I'll use a different example. The PA. Really interesting for me is that the PA has created, in a very short space of time, they've grown. And their growth has mainly been around ward councillors. They've been doing by-election after by-election. And I can tell you within the PA communities, people will go to their ward councillor when there's something wrong. They will put pressure on that ward councillor. That ward councillor will make themselves know. That's the way the PA has grown. So we all look at Gayton and think Gayton is the reason the PA has grown. No. The PA has grown because of local leaders becoming ward councillors and having access to being able to make a call to the MMC to say something is wrong in this particular community.
So now coming to the result. The electorate, those that did vote, shout out to you guys, have spoken and said, okay, we don't want anyone with an outright majority. Now we're facing government of national unity, which I guess, one, not everyone understands what it looks like and what to expect from it. From your analysis, interpretation, and expertise, how would you break that or make that palatable?
Oh, what is a government of national unity? The golden question. So I'm firstly going to say, I don't think what we're going to end up with is a true government of national unity. So let me explain what I think a government of national unity is versus the thing that's going on right now. So usually a government of national unity is created in a context where there is some kind of crisis outside the numbers that's being solved for, right? So in 2018, Kenya had a government of national unity where a candidate, Raila Odinga, lost the presidential election. Uhuru Kenyatta won the presidential election, but there was political instability and there was violence, basically from the side of those who lost. And so to broker peace, they created a government of national unity and made Raila Odinga the prime minister. It had nothing to do with the numbers. It wasn't a coalition. They didn't need to do that. They did it to bring about a certain kind of societal outcome that was necessary or political outcome that was necessary. in 1994, we had a government of national unity. The ANC had 65% of the vote. They won by a larger margin than in most elections. They created a government of national unity because there were a number of sectors of society that they weren't sure were going to accept a result. So even before the election, they decided it would be a government of national unity so that a portion of society who were white people who had benefited from apartheid, who may not have believed in the outcome, would feel like, okay, we're not going to be outright losers in this scenario, so let's allow this election to happen. The IFP, we all know about the violence that was taking place. The IFP actually wasn't going to participate in the election until maybe a month before the time. And it was a government of national unity proposal that brought them on board. They were willing to disrupt having the election. So government of national unity actually had a strategic purpose in 1994, and it had nothing to do with numbers. This is not a true government of national unity unless somebody can tell me what it is we're doing. What is the purpose of the thing, right? Okay. Do you know what the purpose is?
So from what I'm understanding in terms of what you just explained is that it was, or where it has been done was done to achieve a particular purpose of uniting. It wasn't necessarily a consolidation of numbers. A
societal issue, not necessarily an electoral issue. You were solving a political issue, not an electoral issue.
So now it does root down to a societal issue where you have maybe 20%, 29% in the moonshot that are essentially right, and you have a percentage that's left and those in the center, and somewhat finding a way to get 50% plus one.
So that makes it an electoral issue. The moment you say you're trying to find a way to get 50% but plus one, you need a coalition. Because that's about the numbers. Yeah. That's about an electoral outcome. That's not a government of national unity per se. That's a coalition. So just call it a coalition and find people to make up the numbers. By calling it a government of national unity, I feel like the ANC as the largest party couldn't decide who it wanted to go into coalition with, and so has made it a broad call to whoever is willing to work with each other, which I think is a ANC crisis, not a societal crisis. I think the ANC is, because there are so many iterations of coalitions that could get you past the 50% mark with the ANC at the center that are now no longer on the table. And I think one of the concerns that it raises with the government of national unity is we have 18 parties in parliament. The ANC has not put a threshold on it. So in 1994, even before the election, a threshold of 5% was set. So parties would enter a government of national unity if they had 5%. Understanding the dynamics of the country, they knew who the potential partners would have been before that anyway.
Where you systematically outlined.
Exactly. In this case, it's become a bit of a free-for-all, which means now all 18 parties, regardless of whether you're a party that got 0.4% or a party that got 40%, all of you could have a ministry. All of you could have powers. It makes it more complicated. I think it has created a crisis that didn't exist because it's made it more complicated than if the ANC just decided on what kind of path it wanted to take. Here are the policy proposals. Here are the people who we are going to approach about these policy proposals, and then we're going to try and put together a coalition government. That would have been a simpler thing to do. This makes it more complicated. I don't even know if they have the time to do the kind of legwork that it takes. But I think that, in essence, it's going to now be a matter of parties opting in and opting out. And we will then have to create a government based on whoever, the coalition of the willing is what I'm calling it. That we are not going to have a government of national unity, we're going to have a coalition of the willing. And then we're going to have to look in all of those parties about who was actually willing and who wasn't, and whether those different factions within parties will hold.
And now there seems to be quite a bit of uncertainty as to what's going to happen on Friday, whether it's quorum, constitution. Can you break down what's happening there?
So on Friday, Parliament is going to elect a president. So I've been saying this for months now, that when we go and vote, we are technically electing 400 potential presidents. That's what we're doing, because Parliament decides. Parliament votes for a president. We don't vote for a president. And I think that's one of the big lessons that comes out of this election, is that we must not assume that we are voting for a president when we are actually not, right? So who's going to be president, I have no doubt, is a big part of the conversations that are happening. And the questions about who's willing to work with the ANC if Cyril Ramaphosa is president or not, all of that, as uncomfortable as it is, are valid things to ask because we didn't vote for presidents, right? That being said, we have a process that needs to be followed. So by Friday, members of parliament will be sworn in. Once they're sworn in, they then need to elect a speaker, a deputy speaker, and then a president, in that order. The presiding officer for that sitting is the Chief Justice. So he convenes them and he oversees these elections. And then we have a president elected. And how a president gets elected is by a 50+1 of whoever shows up. Now that we know for sure, is that whoever is there, a 50+1 of those MPs will determine a president.
Which is a minimum of 134, which is a third.
Well, that's what quorum is.
Yes. Okay.
So that's what quorum is. What's debated right now, because of the MK Party's constitutional challenge, is what they're calling Section 46. And what Section 46 debates is whether or not, if less than 350 people are sworn in, whether Parliament has been constituted. That is the question that the MK Party is essentially asking. Now, I don't know what the legal answer to that is. I'm not a judge, and I'm definitely not a constitutional court judge. And so I'm not going to get into that terrain of saying whether the MK Party is right or wrong about their interpretation of the Constitution. What I will say is that outside of somebody saying that the MK Party is right about that, the process is going to unfold. So unless something happens in the next few days where the Constitutional Court says, hey, listen, we agree with the MK Party, I suspect that process is going to go. How Parliament will vote is going to be a combination of a few things. One, the seats in Parliament as allocated to parties, right? So you would have a very clear sense that whoever the ANC puts up, we assume that will be Cyril Ramaphosa, whoever they nominate into the room, that at least 159 people out of potentially 200, if MK doesn't show up less, will vote for the candidate the ANC puts forward. So part of building a coalition is also about getting as many votes secured before Friday to make sure that that 50+1 actually holds. That's one of the difficulties of this week, is parties need to figure out and make sure that they go into the sitting having a sense of what the numbers look like. It is, however, a secret ballot. And so that does make it a little nerve-wracking for all of us because we don't know. And they know, but do they really know? But as the course of events goes, there's very little reason to believe that Friday won't happen and that we won't be able to elect a president. The system for electing a president also makes it hard to not elect one because you have to elect, your final election is between two people. And there's also the possibility of only nominating one person and then having no need for an election because that person would be automatically president. All of those things are possible. I don't think at this point there's much reason to believe that Friday won't happen and that an election of a president won't happen. But the truth is, once we have the president, we don't necessarily have government. We still need the president to then constitute cabinet. We still need parliament to then constitute the chairs of committees. So there's still a process of creating the government. And so even if all the negotiations are not settled by Friday, we could have the election of a president and then the formation and negotiations for the formation of a government of national unity thereafter. All of those things are possible.
Now, moving forward, obviously people that didn't vote or didn't register to vote, you guys should go register and vote next time. What are the factors that you and population in general, but youth in particular, should consider the next time they go to the polls?
It's a great question. I think the first thing is anybody who thinks that because they didn't vote, they didn't contribute towards the outcome we have right now is incorrect, right? Especially if you've registered, but even if you haven't. I keep saying to people, voting is a group assignment. And the creation of a government is a group assignment. And so when a group member in a group assignment doesn't participate, that doesn't mean that they don't share in the outcome. You can opt out of voting, but you cannot opt out of being governed. That's essentially, where we stand. And so I would encourage people to think about non-participation, because non-participation is also something that people opt into. Most people are not just not thinking about whether they're going to vote or not. They're thinking about it, and they're opting out. Some people are opting out because they don't want to be a part of the result. Some people are opting out because they've not been enthused by the parties, or they haven't found a party that has engaged them sufficiently. All of those are valid. But we must remember that the outcome affects us all. And so we must care about the outcome, even if we did not vote. What this means, I think, going into the future, is that we do have to ask ourselves if the political terrain is only about the politicians and how it is about us as well, right? And so I said earlier, I think coalitions, I think a government of national unity, however we want to frame it, is an opportunity for people who are not in politics, who are citizens, who are voters, who are members of community, to start engaging not a political party, but all political parties. Because two things are going to happen in the next few years. One is that no vote in parliament, even if you have a government of national unity, no vote is guaranteed to go the way of whichever party puts forward legislation, a budget, etc. Everybody's going to need to negotiate. And so that means there's opportunities to influence what those negotiations are based on. So if we've watched Parliament before, people debate in Parliament. We look in on these debates on the budget, debates on SONA, debates on all sorts of things. Those debates have in the past been ceremonial because we've known if the bill comes from the governing party that's got over 50% of the vote, it's very, very possible that they're just going to vote in the legislation that comes from their party. In this context, that's not a given, which means that we have the ability now to actually engage parties about how they vote on everything that goes into Parliament. Parliament is going to become more significant than it has ever been. The second thing is going to be that different parties are going to be able to present bills with a lot more frequency because there's a lot more opportunity to have partners that might support it. And so where in the past most bills have originated from cabinet, I think there's going to be way more opportunity for bills to originate from members of parliament themselves and other political parties. So instead of us just complaining about something, we can ask parties to originate bills to change things. And so I think there's a lot more opportunity for people who've been outside of politics to start to look into that, about how you can influence the politics of the day and not leave politics to the politicians.
Thank you. Thank you for giving us insight and making everything palatable.
I hope I did.
No, you definitely did. It was very insightful. Guys, thank you for tuning in. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, share, comment. Let us know what you'd like to know, how you'd like to know, who you'd like to know it from. And we'll do our best to make that palatable for you. TJ Maslela.